Countless dead rest here in peace, cradled by the comfort of dark. Death is equitable, accepting. We will all one day be welcomed by her embrace.
I was known as a deathbed companion. I lay with the remains of an exalted noble. To grant him another chance at life, to do so is the purpose of my being.
Lord Godwyn, such cruelty, such humiliation. My poor, sweet lordling should have died a true death. As the first of the demigods to die. As a martyr to destined death.
The misshapen corpse on the Stormveil. That is a sacred relic of the Black Knives plot, as that famed night of assassination is known. Do you know of those who live in death? The very notion of life in death defies the Golden Order.
We weave death and watch over the dead. This task was granted to me by the one who gave us the first death.
We will sing here forever, as we always have.
They call me a foul and rotten witch. Yet you still wish to be held by me?
These souls have committed no offense. They have every right to life, only they happen to touch upon a flaw in the Order.
Some were rich, others poor, some wise, some dull, but now they're all just dead.
Death is the end we all must accept. It is sleep, it is quiet, it is peaceful. Death in the lands between Lordran and Drangleic is the unchanging force that is feared by the established hierarchy. Death in all these worlds have their masters. Gravelord Nito and Godwyn the Prince of Death are the figures that represent the calm that awaits all beyond the grave. While other gods and rulers would squabble amongst themselves for greater power, these two would continue to operate beyond their death to become something more. They would welcome the discarded, the meek, and the persecuted. After all, being alive is just the beginning. We will all return to our roots, one way or another. Gravelord Nito was one of the 4 beings who inherited a Lord's soul from the first flame. Nito, as the Lord of Death, was likely the first being to die after the appearance of the first flame that introduced the concepts of life and death to the world. He would also be known as the first of the dead. Nito would resurrect through necromancy and take on the form of a giant mass of bones covered in a large black cloak. Besides being the father of necromancy, Nito would also have the ability to control a miasma of death that could kill just about any living being, including the ancient dragons, as we see in the opening cutscene. After the war with the dragons ended, Nito would reside in the catacombs and Tomb of the Giants, where he would enter a deep sleep. In this state, Nito oversaw and administered death. His domain was the resting place for the gods, including those that resided in Anor Londo. Followers would begin to flock to his realm of light devouring dark, where they would become part of his Gravelord servants' covenant. Upon being given a Gravelord sword, followers would then begin to spread death through the eyes of death across the many worlds that intertwine and converge upon Lordran. Nito would also cultivate the rite of kindling, which would be used to strengthen the bonfires that littered the landscape. The ritual allowed clerics of the Way of White or undead through the use of humanity to increase the amount of Estus that could be gained at a bonfire. The creation of this rite could be a hint at Nito's potential role in the creation of the prophecy to lure a chosen undead to link the first flame. Nito's legacy would live on in Dark Souls' direct sequel, Dark Souls 2. This title would reveal additional followers created by Nito that would shed further light on this mysterious lord. The first of these beings were the Finito. These beings were capable of weaving death and tasking them with watching over the dead. Much like how death occurs naturally in the real world, the philosophy of death was non-discriminatory and inevitable as conveyed through Agdane's dialogue. The second group of followers created by Nito were the Milfinito. These women were tasked with singing to comfort the dead. They knew little of the outside world or themselves beyond this task. Both groups of followers would carry out their tasks long after the Great Dead One was gone. The Finito would guard and ensure those in the undead crypt would remain in a state of death as the Grave Wardens. The Milfinito would sing to the dead to bring them comfort. The crypt was also kept in a state of perpetual darkness, likely to produce greater soothing, stillness, and peace to the dead. The marshy landscape leading to the crypt was home to the bright bugs said to have been born from the corpse of Nito. These insects would dance to the song of the Milfinito as well. Many groups attempted to conquer the undead crypt, but were eventually turned into guardians by the Grave Wardens to never rest again for all eternity. The Lady of Witches would ally themselves with the Grave Wardens at some point, taking a position within the undead crypt. These witches were servants of Galib, the god of disease. It is likely that this god was an interpretation of Nito from an offshoot group of witches. This alliance would not last long, as the Wardens deemed them as blasphemers for not properly upholding their position and not properly respecting death according to their set description. While there was a large establishment of followers in the crypt, many had forgotten who Nito was. He was referred to as the Great Dead One by his followers. Beyond his followers, Nito's memory and influence would live on through his literal soul. It is likely that the Rotten came into possession of Nito's soul, which would transform him into the amalgamation of bodies we see in-game. The Rotten would create a sanctuary for all things thrown away in Drangleic, not too unlike the First of the Dead. On a New Game Plus playthrough, the Rotten will drop the old Dead One's soul, aiding to this connection between Nito and the Rotten further. Nito's legacy would also live on in Dark Souls 3 in some small areas such as the Ritual of Farron Keep, through his likeness being depicted in one of the carvings above the shrine. There is also suggestion he was devoured by Aldred, since we can see some of his old attacks in that particular boss fight. The Lord of Death would leave the Soul series as he entered, calmly and quietly. In the lands between, another god of death would live on and die in a similar manner. Godwyn the Golden was a child born of Queen Marika the Eternal, and Godfrey, the first Elden Lord. As a demigod, Godwyn was beloved by all and was Marika's favorite child. He embodied the tenets of the Golden Order to the fullest and served as the ideal inheritor to Queen Marika's rule. Godwyn was known for his loving acts and heroism. Most notably, he played a pivotal role in the defense of Leyndell from the great dragon Grandsax, of which he emerged victorious. He would also befriend the dragon Fortisax after besting him in combat. This alliance would establish the ancient dragon cult that worshipped them and studied their lightning incantations. The faction was even permitted by the Golden Order. Godwyn would be the first of the demigods to die during the Night of Black Knives. His death would begin the Shattering, acting as the catalyst for the conflict between the remaining demigods. Godwyn's body was carved with a half-wheel centipede by the Black Knife assassins sent by Ranni. The same mark would be etched into her body as well. Ranni would die in body but not in soul. Godwyn would perish in the opposite manner, with his body still alive while his soul would die. His body would be laid to rest in the Erdtree roots within the deep root depths. However, since his soul was dead, he couldn't die a true death. His burial would eventually create the death root that would spread throughout the lands between and give rise to those who live in death. Fortisax would try to save Godwyn by entering his death dream, but would succumb to the death blight, corrupting his form. Godwyn's followers within the dragon cult would take upon a new identity as the Death Knights, still honoring their lord. However, Godwyn's following would multiply in his new form. Godwyn's death was not the end for him. Since his body was still alive, his corpse would become known as the Prince of Death. This new form would begin cropping up in the lands between and the Shadow Realm, similar to the Death Root. In this new form, those who live in death would begin to worship him. One of the many endings or ages the Tarnished can usher in revolves around Godwyn and the deathbed companion Fia. With both halves of the centipede wheel, Fia will lay with Godwyn's corpse to create the mending rune of the Death Prince. With that rune, the Tarnished can become the lord of the Age of the Duskborn. This mending rune would theoretically introduce the concept of life within death on a grand scale to the lands between. As Godwyn the Golden, he would amass many followers as a result of his friendship with the ancient dragons. The ancient dragon knights would worship the dragons and utilize the lightning dragon cult incantations. The Death Knights would assume a new role and aesthetic following Godwyn's demise and travel to the Land of Shadow in search of his cadaver surrogate to usher in the Age of the Duskborn, according to their armor description. Godwyn's influence would reach commoners in some omens. A notable faction that would rise from the Prince of Death would be the Mausoleum Knights. These soldiers can be found guarding the wandering mausoleums that would house the soulless demigods. One of the most notable features of their armor are the large feathers that could be a nod to the Deathrite birds. These soldiers willingly curse themselves through self-beheading in order to serve in death. Their shields are adorned with the sun eclipse, representing their protection over the soulless demigods and keeping destined death at bay. They would watch over the death of their demigod lords and swear to serve them eternally, even if it meant the most brutal of deaths to get there. Those who live in death would also flock to Godwyn's presence, felt throughout the lands. These would include variants of skeletons, gravekeepers, snails, deathbirds, and deathrite birds. Many of these beings can be found surrounding the Tibia Mariners, who are essentially shepherds for the dead. They too can be spotted around areas littered with deathroot. The most notable of the followers of the Prince of Death is Fia, the deathbed companion. Her goal is to receive the warmth and vigor of many champions and then lay with the remains of Godwyn in order to grant him another life. This act of laying with others and essentially absorbing their life essence was seen as a sacred ritual in her homeland. In the Round Table Hold, she will grant those who hug her with the Baldekin's blessing, which will increase poise. Hugging Fia also causes player health to decrease by a small increment. She would aid both the Tarnished and Ragier, a Spellblade, investigating those who live in death in their search for one of the halves of the curse mark of death. After obtaining the first half, she will kill D, Hunter of the Dead, for the second half. Fia will then retreat from the Round Table to return the curse mark and lay with Godwyn's remains. With the assistance of the Tarnished, they will enter the Deathbed Dream to defeat Lich Dragon Fortisax. From there, the Tarnished can use the full curse mark wheel as a mending rune to restore fractured America in order to usher in the Age of the Duskborn. Upon closer inspection of Nito and Godwyn together, similar themes and gameplay elements can be found in my view. Both lords to me represent the ideal lord, or the one that seems the most in line with their title, free of ego and selfishness. Nito worked only to fulfill his purpose as the administrator of death. He seemed to have no ego or quarrels after the war with the dragons, while the other lords would bumble their way through trying to relight the first flame and clutching tightly to their crumbling world. Gwyn's ego would be his downfall. Izalith's hubris would be the end of her domain and her children. Seath would succumb to his intellectual madness, and the furtive pygmy would be locked away from the rest of the world, taken advantage of by Gwyn. Nito is simply like a force of nature. He administers and oversees death and seems to want nothing else than to simply sleep. Much like the ancient dragons, he remains stagnant and unperturbed. Similarly, Godwyn is the ideal lord in that he was America's golden child. He was probably the only child that she actually loved. The inhabitants of the land likely saw Godwyn in the same light. He was a stand-up guy who was able to defeat the dragons through diplomacy and friendship rather than brute strength. His death likely would have been the only one that could have triggered the Shattering simply because Marika cared about him so much. He could have even been the glue that held the family together. The same could be said for Godwyn in his new state as the Prince of Death. He, much like Nito, seems to be in a stagnant state free of conflict with the other demigods. Even in his new form, he is still beloved by his followers, like the Death Knights. They still serve him, even beyond his death. Nito and Godwyn, in my view, are the most respected of their associated lords and demigods as we see through their actions or lack thereof. This might also aid why they are both feared and respected as well. They control death, the one condition that both worlds are essentially afraid of. Similarly, both Godwyn and Nito were the first to die. Nito would perish and then return as the mass of skeletons and bones as we see him in-game. It also makes sense given that one must die to become/control death. The same instance can be said for Godwyn, who dies and is reborn into something new and far more influential. He now not only has his former dragon cult followers adapting to his new condition, but he has a whole new legion of followers like those who live in death and the Mausoleum Knights and soldiers. To me, both of these figures had to die to become something more than what they once were. They had to become what they would control, death. Nito had to die in order to develop necromancy and be the overseer of the dead. Even Nito's death at the hands of the chosen undead would not be the end of him, as his influence would live on through the Finito and Milfinito, as well as the Rotten. Godwyn had to be the one to die in order for the shattering to happen, but was able to essentially come out on top. He rose above the petty squabbles of the shattering, not only because he was physically incapable, but because he was meant to potentially play a role in ushering a more accepting and peaceful age. Both lords highlight that death is not the end, but rather the beginning. Followers of Nito and Godwyn display their worship willingly. Nito's Gravelord servants would flock to his domain, and those who live in death would find a new lord in the Prince of Death. Other factions in both Dark Souls and Elden Ring often worship their respective gods out of fear. Gwyn's dynasty was held together through control and subjugation of those he deemed lesser. The same could be said for the Golden Order, that was a much more exclusive religion, barring access to those seen as lesser, such as the Omens and those touched by the Crucible. Both Lords of Death offer a place for those who may not belong. Death welcomes all into its eternal slumber. Interestingly, both groups would refrain from building large shrines or symbology to showcase their devotion to the gods of death. Followers of Nito would not erect statues or build monuments in Nito's likeness in the catacombs. The faithful simply pray to the god himself, having direct access to the man in charge. Those who live in death in Elden Ring don't build monuments to Godwyn either. Even in the catacombs, there is no symbolism to represent his role as the Prince of Death. This all leads to the idea that both groups are essentially not worshipping the figure, but the concept of death itself. This differs from many factions that we see, where most of the factions give reverence to a particular figure. In the case of death, they just happen to have figureheads that represent the abstract concept of death. Marika, for example, is directly worshipped as the figurehead of the Golden Order, which is the polar opposite to what we see with Nito and Godwyn. Instead, the Gravelord's servants, the Finito, and those who live in death serve death as the concept above their respective figureheads. The Finito have long forgotten Nito, but still worship the practice and preservation of death. Godwyn similarly has lost the title of Godwin the Golden and is simply the Prince of Death. He is the chosen figure by those who live in death, rather than the leader that was forced upon them. I find that the Milfinito and Fia operate in similar fashion to their respective lords. The Milfinito were created to calm the dead through their song that was taught to them by Nito. They were born with a singular purpose and know little outside of that purpose, as it seems to be their only sense of self as we hear through their dialogue. Similarly, Fia has one purpose. Her task was to lay with many champion warriors in the hopes of using their warmth and vigor to bring new life to Godwyn. She is offering some comfort as a deathbed companion for those who are passing on to the next life. Her purpose is to bring Godwyn new life and continue his role as the Prince of Death to become something more. While not entirely the same, I find that the Milfinito and Fia have a similar aesthetic with their attire and demeanor. They both want to be left in peace and fulfill their purpose to serve death. Notably, Fia kills Dee only because he posed a threat to her and her purpose. The Milfinito and Fia are non-hostile to the player character even when attacked, aiding to their more passive nature. The factions of Nito and Godwyn ultimately seem more accepting of followers. They welcome death in all its forms rather than presenting exclusivity or requirements to enter into their fold. Arguably, I find that these groups to be the most welcoming of any in the series. Even Fia's words upon leaving the Round Table state that the Lord of the Many and the Meek will rise once her task is complete. Agding's dialogue also expresses the equal nature of death. No matter who people were in life, it doesn't matter in death. It's all accepting and equitable. An interesting concept that this brings up for me is the notion of right to life. Rogier expresses his wants to those who live in death to have a right to life just as much as anyone, despite being seen as an affront to the order. Fia's dialogue frequently mentions the persecution of those who live in death as well. While there is no suggestion of persecution directly through dialogue among Nito's faithful, it's no surprise to see the dead tucked away in a far corner of the world as we see in-game. I also find that the persecution of the undead likely transferred to the dead as well. Much like the way the catacombs were tucked away, the undead asylum was built isolated from the rest of Lordran. Death in both games is seen as an affront to the proper nature of the worlds, and therefore it is shunned, hated, and persecuted. Their followers want to live in peace, while the established hierarchy says otherwise. From a design perspective, both Nito and Godwyn are left as mysterious beings. We do not know too much about them as the respective lords of death, nor do we engage in direct dialogue with them. Very little item descriptions hint at how they operated in terms of their values and aims. Instead, we only get information from their followers, and even they seem to not entirely understand whom they serve, since they focus more on the worship of death versus the administrators/representatives of death itself. Again, death is a force of nature that is unchanging and unknowable in Lordran, Drangleic, and the lands between. It simply is. There is no school or study or devotion to death. Instead, the followers work to preserve it rather than change or manipulate it. Those who do attempt to manipulate it are punished much like the Lady of Witches. Death is meant to be left undisturbed, and that same nature to want to be left alone is displayed in the followers in their passive nature. Death is essentially peace rather than something that is overtly evil. Instead, it represents the end, but also the beginning of something new. It is the inevitable force we must all come to terms with and should not fear, yet it is a nightmare for figures like Gwyn and Marika. It represents the end of their rule and their power. These figures simply tried to delay the inevitable. They resisted nature and paid the price for it. The Lords of Death would live on and will live on because they do not resist death. Death is the one thing that is truly feared by the gods. They have attained everything they could want, but still resist the very thing they cannot control. Death doesn't need to be presented as something that is overtly dangerous or aggressive to be feared. Death isn't something to be learned or discovered through item descriptions. It simply is, and Nito and Godwyn embody this very unknowingness. We do not need to know about them further because there is nothing to be gained from them. They have no ambitions, they have no designs, they simply are. Perpetually accepting and welcoming to those who will eventually enter their embrace. Thanks for watching. Feel free to share your personal theories on Godwyn and Nito in the comments below. Do you find their presentation to be alike or completely different? I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you like my thoughts on FromSoft titles as well as other video game titles from time to time, feel free to subscribe and like this video if you got something out of it. I appreciate the support as always, and I wish you all an illustrious second life. Take care.
Look at this rotten whore. Naught but expired meat and bone. No more children can be got from this useless flesh. Behold, your mother is dead. This is a proper death, O Prince.
Our Lord will rise, the Lord of the many and the meek. Stay the persecution of those who live in death by becoming our Elden Lord. You are very warm.